I never thought my own sister would do something like this. When I got the invitation list for her wedding and my name was missing, I was devastated but not surprised. She always saw me as the poor sibling. What she didn't know was that I had a plan. One that would not only ruin her big day, but also leave everyone speechless when I stepped out of that limo, with the one man she tried to forget. She had always known her sister looked at her differently. Not with hatred or outright disdain, no, it was something colder than that. A subtle judgment hidden behind polite smiles and passive-aggressive compliments. Growing up, their parents had treated them the same, at least on the surface. But everyone in the family knew that the older sister was the golden child, the one expected to do great things, to marry well, to represent the family name with class and dignity. And the younger one? She was the afterthought. Quiet, reserved, always a little behind in the race of appearances. She had never envied her sister. Not really. Her life was simple, sometimes chaotic, often unglamorous. But it was hers. She had struggled more, worked harder, and built her independence one small victory at a time. She wasn't rich. She didn't wear designer clothes or post perfect photos of brunches and exotic vacations. But she was content. Until the engagement announcement. It came in the form of a picture posted online, her sister smiling with a diamond the size of a raindrop, held close by a man that once, a long time ago, had looked at her the same way. She stared at the screen for a full minute before realizing who it was. Her heart thudded, not with pain or jealousy, but with the quiet numbness of disbelief. She hadn't spoken to him in years. The way they ended things was messy, full of silence and misunderstandings. She had assumed he moved on. But not to her sister. Still, she didn't react. She didn't comment, didn't call, didn't send a message. She swallowed the discomfort and let the days pass. Maybe it was a fluke. Maybe her sister didn't know they had history. But that theory dissolved quickly. Her sister knew. Of course she knew. It had come up once during a family dinner years ago when a name slipped into the conversation like a forgotten shadow. Her sister had narrowed her eyes and smiled. And now here he was about to be her husband. The wedding preparations filled the family chat, the group texts, the endless phone calls between aunts and cousins. Photos of dress fittings, cake tastings, venue tours. She watched it all from the sidelines, uninvited. At first, she thought it was a mistake. An oversight. There had to be a logical reason why she hadn't received an invitation. Maybe it got lost. Maybe it hadn't been sent yet. But as the weeks dragged on and the RSVP deadline passed, the truth settled in her chest like a stone. She wasn't meant to be there. The realization didn't come with tears. It came with a quiet silence, a blank space in her chest where hurt used to live. She had never asked for much. She didn't expect to be the maid of honor or even seated near the front. But not being invited at all? That was deliberate. That was a choice. Her sister didn't want her there. And not just because of the man. It was more than that. It was the way her sister saw her, as a reminder of everything she pretended didn't exist. Struggle. Simplicity. Failure. Poverty. The whispers in the family confirmed what she already suspected. Words like image, status, embarrassment were passed around, barely concealed behind polite tones. Her sister wanted a perfect wedding, with polished guests, curated smiles, and no trace of imperfection. And somehow, just by existing, she was the flaw in the fabric. She didn't fit into the narrative of success her sister had so carefully constructed. She was the broken mirror in a room full of chandeliers. And yet, the betrayal didn't shatter her. It clarified things. For the first time in a long while, she saw her sister for who she really was, not just a woman obsessed with appearances, but someone who believed she was better. Who thought money erased character, that glitter could outshine loyalty. She thought back to all the times she had forgiven the little slights. Brushed off the comments, played along to keep peace in the family. But this wasn't a comment. It wasn't a small slight. It was a rejection of her entire presence. The hardest part wasn't missing the wedding. It was realizing she had never really been part of her sister's life at all. Not in the way that mattered. They were connected by blood, yes, but nothing deeper. No bond. No trust. Just a history of competition her sister had long since declared herself the winner of. And now, with her wedding on the horizon, she had drawn the final line in the sand. You don't belong. She sat in her small apartment, staring out the window as cars passed below. thinking of all the moments they had shared as children. Birthday parties, snow days, late-night whispers when they were supposed to be asleep. All now covered in a layer of dust, like old furniture no one bothered to clean. Maybe it had always been this way, and she had just refused to see it. But now there was no hiding. Her sister's silence had said everything. Still, she didn't confront her. She didn't call to ask why. She didn't beg for a seat at the table. She wasn't going to plead for inclusion in a world that had so clearly rejected her. But that didn't mean she was going to disappear. She had spent her whole life stepping back, staying quiet, trying not to disrupt. But some slights demanded response, not in words but in action. She didn't want revenge. Not exactly. But she wanted to be seen. Really seen. For once. She closed her laptop, stood up slowly, and looked at herself in the mirror. There was nothing flashy about her reflection. No diamonds, no designer brands. But there was something else. Something that had been forming quietly inside her all these years. Strength. Resolve. Fire. Her sister might have erased her from the guest list, but she hadn't erased her from the story. And that, she thought, was going to be her mistake. They had met years ago, long before any wedding invitations or family betrayals, back when life was quieter, and the future still felt open and soft around the edges. He wasn't the type people expected her to be with. He came from a world of clean suits, high expectations, and last names that carried weight in quiet rooms. But somehow their lives had collided in the most unexpected way. They had worked in the same building, crossed paths in elevators, shared glances over cafeteria coffee. It started simply, like most things do, with small talk that turned into real conversations, and glances that lingered just a second too long. He noticed her in a way that made her feel visible, like the noise around her dimmed when he looked her way. He had this quiet calm about him, like someone who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. She admired that, envied it even, because in her world being noticed always felt like a fight. With him she didn't have to fight. She could be herself, messy, thoughtful, unsure, and he made space for all of it. Their connection was never loud or dramatic. It was something steady, something slow-burning. They would stay up late talking about things they couldn't tell anyone else. He was curious about her world, and she was fascinated by his. There was a tenderness between them that didn't need to be spoken. When they walked side by side, they matched without trying. Felt right. But life had a way of pulling them apart before they had a chance to name what they were. His career began to climb fast and sharp while hers was still taking shape. He started missing calls, postponing plans, disappearing behind deadlines and meetings. She tried to understand. She never blamed him, not really. She figured that was just what happened when people grew at different speeds. She told herself that if it was meant to be, it would find its way back. But deep down, she felt the space growing between them. Every silence lingered a little longer. Every message felt colder. Eventually, the momentum faded. One day passed without a reply, then another. And then it stopped entirely. No goodbye. No explanation. Just gone. It hurt in a way she didn't admit out loud. There hadn't been a grand ending, no betrayal or dramatic argument. Just an absence that stretched out until it became permanent. For a while she held on to the what-ifs. What if she had called one more time? What if she had pushed harder? But eventually she let go. Or at least she told herself she did. She buried the hurt and moved forward. There were other things to think about: bills, work, responsibilities. The pain dulled with time, but it never fully left. It stayed quiet, tucked in the corners of her memory, waiting. So when she saw the engagement post, the photo of her sister, wrapped in white and smiling wide next to the man she used to imagine a future with, everything she had suppressed came crashing back in sharp waves. First, she didn't believe it. She stared at the photo, blinking, as if the pixels might rearrange themselves and reveal a different truth. But there was no mistake. It was him. Older, sharper around the eyes, but unmistakably the same. Her sister's new fiancé. She thought she'd feel anger or jealousy or even rage. But what she felt was something colder. A hollow sort of betrayal. Not because he moved on, she had expected that, but because he moved into the one space she never imagined he would. Her sister was everything she wasn't. Polished, perfect, socially graceful, always calculating. Their lives didn't intersect unless it served a purpose. And now this man, someone who had once made her feel seen, was standing beside the one person who had always looked through her. The questions were endless. How had they met? Had he known she was her sister? Had they ever talked about her? She tried not to care. She tried to tell herself it didn't matter, that they were both free to make their choices. But it mattered. It mattered because it confirmed something she had always feared, that in her sister's eyes, everything was a game, and winning meant taking everything, even what was never hers to begin with. Worse than the confusion was the silence. Neither of them reached out. Not him. Not her sister. There was no explanation, no acknowledgement. Just a photo, a caption, and an entire history rewritten without her. And what burned more than anything was the realization that they had made her invisible again. Erased from the story like she had never been part of it at all. The man she once loved, and the sister she had once trusted, had chosen to pretend she didn't exist. She started replaying memories in her mind, trying to find the cracks. Had her sister always envied her connection with him? Had he ever mentioned her after things fell apart? Were there signs she missed? The more she thought, the more the memories shifted. Moments that once felt warm now felt suspicious. Laughs echoed with a new meaning. She remembered the way her sister asked about her job with mock curiosity, how she once commented that she'd never date someone from that side of town. And now that same man was going to be part of her sister's life forever. But time has a strange way of reframing pain. What once hurt began to sharpen her instead of weaken her. It reminded her of what she had survived, of the pieces she had put back together without anyone's help. She didn't need validation from either of them anymore. But the fact remained. He had once seen her. And even if he forgot, even if he pretended otherwise, she hadn't. She remembered everything, the quiet moments, the soft beginnings, the ache of the end. So when she heard his name again, months later, it didn't bring a rush of pain. It brought clarity. He wasn't just her sister's fiancé. He was a thread in a story that had never been fully told. A chapter left open. A part of her that still waited for closure. And maybe, just maybe, the universe had a strange sense of timing. Because when their paths crossed again, unexpected and quiet, there was a flicker in his eyes. A hesitation. A shadow of recognition. Like he remembered too. And that was all she needed. Not revenge. Not apology. Just proof that she had mattered once. Enough to haunt him. Enough to change everything. The days that followed were quiet, but not empty. She didn't speak of the wedding, didn't bring it up with family, didn't ask questions or seek explanations. There was nothing left to explain. The silence around the event was a confirmation in itself. Her absence was not a mistake, it was deliberate, strategic, and cruel in its elegance. She was being erased without a sound. Yet instead of collapsing inward, she began to shift. Slowly, deliberately, and without theatrics, she started planning something she hadn't ever given herself the space to imagine. It wasn't about revenge, not exactly. It was about reclaiming something that had been stolen again and again, her dignity, her narrative, her presence. The idea came not as a flash of inspiration but as a slow build, like a storm gathering on the horizon. At first, it was a thought she barely entertained. But it kept returning, clearer and more defined with each passing day. She would not beg to be included in her sister's picture-perfect world, but she would step into it on her own terms. Not as an afterthought, not as an outsider peeking in, but as a force. She would show up at the wedding not to make a scene, but to be undeniable. To remind them, and herself, that she could not be erased so easily. There was no dramatic makeover montage, no sudden discovery of hidden beauty. She didn't need to become someone else. The transformation she pursued was deeper than surface. It was about presenting herself the way she had always deserved to be seen, confident, composed, powerful in silence. She began with small changes. She revisited her wardrobe, not to impress anyone else, but to express herself in a way that matched the woman she had become, elegant, grounded, unshaken. She chose fabrics that felt good on her skin, cuts that highlighted her strengths, and colors that reflected her calm intensity. Nothing loud, nothing begging for attention. Just sharp, purposeful presence. She booked appointments she had long postponed. Not because she needed validation, but because she finally felt worthy of the care she had denied herself. A haircut that framed her face in strength, skincare routines that made her feel refreshed instead of hidden. Her nails, once chipped and overlooked, now stood polished like armor. Every choice was intentional, not for anyone else's gaze, but for the one she saw in the mirror. This wasn't about impressing her sister or the man who once vanished from her life. It was about showing up for herself in ways she never had before. As the external came into focus, she turned inward. She revisited the parts of herself she had been forced to abandon in the scramble of survival. The creative spark she once ignored in favor of practicality. The books she had wanted to read, the thoughts she had long suppressed. She began writing again, journaling her emotions, not as a victim of betrayal, but as a witness to her own strength. She worked on her posture, not to appear proud, but because she was. She made space for joy in her life, even in small doses, sunlight on her skin, walks without purpose, moments of stillness. These quiet acts of resistance built a foundation that no designer dress could ever replicate. The final piece came with a decision that felt both surreal and inevitable. If she was going to attend the wedding, she wouldn't arrive quietly or slip into the background. She would enter with grace, style, and a message. She began making calls, inquiries she never imagined herself making. Renting a limousine was extravagant, absurd even, but something about the image stuck with her. Not because she wanted to flaunt wealth, she had none to flaunt, but because the symbolism was too powerful to ignore. Arriving in a limo was not about transportation. It was about stepping out of years of dismissal and into visibility. It was about rewriting the story her sister had been trying to control for so long. Coordinating the logistics took time. She researched companies, negotiated prices, worked extra shifts to afford the cost. It wasn't easy, but every hour she worked, every dollar she saved, fueled her with a new sense of purpose. She was investing not just in a moment, but in herself. In reclaiming her worth in the most visual, undeniable way possible. When she finally reserved the car, a sleek, dark vehicle that demanded attention without desperation, she felt something settle inside her. This was happening. She was going to the wedding, and she wouldn't be going alone. It started with a message she hadn't expected. Short, polite, but loaded with memory. He had reached out again. Not long messages. No explanations. Just a simple check-in as if no time had passed. She could have ignored it. Part of her wanted to, but curiosity won. They exchanged a few messages. Tentative, careful, then a few more. The tone shifted. They spoke about the past in vague terms, never touching the core, just circling the edges. But the connection resurfaced, undeniable and unspoken. When she mentioned casually that she hadn't been invited to the wedding, he paused, digitally, emotionally. Something in his next message carried weight. A question. A suggestion. The possibility of presence. She didn't say yes immediately. She didn't want to be anyone's tool or symbol. But after reflection, she saw the opportunity not as an act of spite, but as a statement. They weren't trying to hurt anyone. But maybe, just maybe, they both needed closure. Maybe they both had been denied their voice. And so she said yes. If she was going to walk into that carefully curated celebration of lies, she would not walk in alone. She would arrive beside the man who was once hers. Not to rekindle a flame, but to honor what had been stolen, and to finally close a chapter that had never ended properly. The dress she chose for that day was not loud. Not glittering with sequins or designed to shock. It was simple but powerful, deep in color, form-fitting, with lines that moved like water. When she stood in front of the mirror wearing it, she didn't see revenge or bitterness. She saw clarity. She saw the girl who had once been overlooked now standing in full presence. Her hair was pulled back, not to hide but to reveal. Her makeup was soft, deliberate, accentuating rather than covering. She looked like herself, but more. As the day approached, there were moments of doubt. Whispers in the back of her mind reminding her of the risks. The possibility of chaos. The judgment of others. But those voices didn't hold the same power anymore. She had spent too long living quietly, surviving instead of thriving. Now she was stepping into the storm by choice, not as a victim but as the eye of it. Calm, centered, ready. The morning of the wedding was bright and cruelly perfect, the kind of day designed for celebration. She stood by the window of her apartment, watching the sunlight touch the buildings across the street, and took one final breath before turning to leave. When the limousine pulled up to her door, it didn't feel like overcompensation. It felt like a threshold. She stepped inside not as someone trying to prove her worth, but as someone who finally understood it. And as the car pulled away, carrying her through familiar streets toward the heart of her sister's performance, she didn't feel small anymore. She didn't feel like a guest arriving uninvited. She felt like a reckoning. Quiet, graceful, undeniable. And for the first time in a long time she felt whole. The venue stood like a postcard, all white columns and manicured gardens, the kind of place chosen for its ability to impress rather than its warmth. It was the kind of setting her sister would have dreamed of since childhood. Grand but sterile, elegant but cold. A backdrop more for photos than for memories. Cars lined the gravel drive, each one shining. Each guest stepping out in carefully chosen attire that said exactly the right things about who they were, and who they wanted others to believe they were. Laughter floated through the air, but it was the rehearsed kind, too polished to be real. Everything about the scene was curated. Everything, that is, until the limousine rolled into view. It didn't rush. Didn't need to. The long black vehicle glided slowly up the drive, drawing eyes before it even stopped. Heads turned gradually, then all at once, curiosity blooming across the small crowd of mingling guests near the entrance. They paused mid-conversation, trying to gauge who it might be. A late arrival? A VIP? A mistake? The door hadn't opened yet, but already the mood had shifted. Something unexpected had entered their polished little world, and no one knew what to make of it. She waited for a moment inside the car, her heart steady but alert. Not nervous. Not anymore. Just aware. She smoothed the fabric of her dress and checked the clasp of her purse, not for vanity but for readiness. Every detail had been chosen carefully. The woman about to step out of that car wasn't crashing a wedding. She wasn't here to cause a scene. She was simply returning to a place that had pretended she no longer existed and doing so on her own terms. When the door opened, the air seemed to pause. Her heel touched the ground first, then the full figure of her emerged, composed and precise. She stepped onto the gravel with effortless grace, head held high, back straight, her presence absorbing the weight of every stare without flinching. It wasn't that she was overdressed. She wasn't. She was simply dressed in a way that demanded attention, understated elegance with the kind of confidence that cannot be bought or faked. The sunlight caught her in the right ways, highlighting her quiet power, the way she moved as if she belonged there more than anyone else. Beside her, he stepped out next. He was calm, measured, his expression unreadable but clearly aware of the stir they were causing. He didn't touch her, didn't rush to her side. They didn't need physical closeness to make a statement. Their arrival together was enough. The guests didn't know what to say. There were whispers, sharp glances, quiet gasps poorly masked by fake smiles. Some recognized her immediately. Others needed a few seconds for the shock to settle in. And when realization bloomed, when they saw who she was, who she had arrived with, and what her presence implied, the discomfort was almost tangible. It was the kind of entrance her sister would have envied had she not been the one it disrupted. The staff at the entrance hesitated. They had not expected her name. Her presence wasn't on the list. She wasn't supposed to exist today. But protocol faltered in the face of poise. She didn't cause a scene. She didn't raise her voice or demand entry. She simply gave them a look that made them question the risk of stopping her. After a brief, awkward pause, they let her through. Doors were held open. She walked forward. Inside, the venue was no less extravagant. Strings of white flowers lined the ceiling beams, candles flickered in golden holders, tables glittered with glassware and place cards written in looping calligraphy. But despite the luxury, everything felt staged, like a play performed for the sake of perception. It was a world her sister had built meticulously, each detail another brick in the illusion of perfection. And now in the middle of that illusion stood a disruption that no one had accounted for. As she moved through the crowd, conversations trailed off and eyes followed her. Some people smiled hesitantly, unsure how to respond. Others looked away quickly, pretending not to notice, as if her presence might vanish if ignored. But she didn't vanish. She moved with intention, each step echoing with years of swallowed pride, forgotten kindnesses, and quiet endurance. She passed faces she knew, distant relatives, old neighbors, former classmates, each one a reminder of how far she had come and how far she had been cast out. She spotted her mother first, sitting at a table near the front, surrounded by carefully chosen guests. Her expression flickered when she saw her daughter. Not rage. Not shock. Something else. Something more complicated. It passed quickly, masked by the same polite smile she wore at every family gathering. Her father's reaction was more obvious, a tightening of the jaw, a sudden shift in posture. But neither of them said a word. Not yet. And then finally she saw her. The bride. Her sister stood near the floral archway, the photographer adjusting her train, her veil, the angle of her shoulder. She was in her element, the center of her own universe, glowing in manufactured light. And then her eyes caught the movement. The unfamiliar hush. The way everyone else had begun to look in one direction. She turned her head and saw them, her sister, stepping into the room with silent thunder, and the man who once stood beside her. Now walking beside someone else. Time didn't stop, but it shifted. The moment lengthened unnaturally, stretched by tension that no words could carry. Her sister froze. Her face paled. Her hand, resting on the bouquet, trembled just slightly. No one moved. For a split second, the entire room was suspended in breathless silence. And then reality resumed, only now the mood had changed. The illusion had cracked. The photographer lowered his camera. The planner looked confused. The whispers resumed, louder now, less careful. The guests didn't know where to look. Some stared openly. Others avoided eye contact, unsure whether to smile or retreat. The bride straightened her back, recovered her expression, turned away sharply, but the damage was already done. The story had already begun to write itself in the minds of every witness. She didn't make a scene. She didn't raise her voice or offer theatrics. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough. She found a seat near the edge of the room, not too close to the front, but not hidden either. She sat with poise, crossing her legs gently, resting her hands on her lap, chin slightly lifted. She wasn't there to provoke. She was there to exist. And that, in this world of curated perfection, was more radical than anything she could have said. The ex-fiancé stood beside her, calm but clearly aware of the effect they were having. He didn't speak, didn't gesture, didn't offer an apology or a smug glance. Like her, he was composed, collected. They had entered this room not as troublemakers, but as reminders. That history cannot be erased with silence. That appearances do not protect against truth. That even in a room built to exclude her, she could still walk in and shift the balance of power without a single word. As the ceremony drew near, guests began to shift in their seats, unsure where to look, unsure how to feel. The atmosphere had changed. The bride tried to refocus to regain control of the narrative. But control is fragile. And now, with every glance over her shoulder, every whispered name, every moment of silence that wasn't part of the plan, she would feel the weight of the one person she had tried so hard to erase. Because her sister hadn't just shown up. She had arrived. The ceremony had begun, but its rhythm faltered. Though the officiant spoke clearly and the couple stood beneath the arch as planned, the energy in the room was wrong, off-kilter, disjointed. No one was truly present, not even the bride and groom. The scripted vows, the polished phrases, the carefully timed tears, they all felt thin now, paper-thin, unable to mask the undercurrent of tension that gripped the space like a second silence. People shifted in their seats more than usual. Eyes darted, unsure whether to focus on the couple at the altar or the woman sitting near the back, radiant and composed, with the man at her side who was never supposed to be anywhere else but standing where the groom now stood. Her sister tried to focus. She blinked too often, smiled too wide, and held the bouquet so tightly her knuckles paled beneath the satin gloves. From a distance, she might still have looked perfect, but up close, the cracks were visible. Her voice shook slightly during the vows. Her breath hitched in the pauses between sentences. She did not glance at her sister seated quietly in the audience, but she felt her presence like a light too bright to ignore. She had built this day meticulously, obsessed over every detail. But there was one variable she hadn't accounted for, and now it was threatening to unravel everything. The moment the ceremony ended and applause rippled through the crowd, awkward and delayed, the shift became undeniable. The bride turned quickly, brushing past her new husband, her smile gone the instant the cameras lowered. She moved with purpose, heels snapping against the polished floor, cutting through the sea of well-wishers with urgency. Guests turned to watch her, whispering and speculating as she made her way toward the one person she clearly didn't want to see but could no longer avoid. Her sister didn't rise. She remained seated, still and waiting, not out of defiance but out of control. True power doesn't chase. It waits. And that, more than anything, seemed to enrage the bride. They met in the center of the reception room, surrounded by tables and floral arrangements, the music low and tense like a heartbeat in the background. The bride's expression flickered between disbelief and fury. She leaned in, her voice low but sharp, words falling like stones. But the other woman didn't flinch. Her expression didn't change. Whatever was said, and no one close enough could hear clearly, did not land the way it was intended. The calm in her eyes remained, even as the bride's composure frayed. A second later, the bride's voice rose louder now, no longer a whisper but something that echoed. The wedding ended without much celebration. Guests left earlier than expected, some out of discomfort, others out of quiet disapproval. The energy had shifted irreversibly, and everyone knew it. What was meant to be a display of elegance and triumph had turned into a study in contrast. Forced perfection standing beside quiet authenticity, and authenticity had won. Not through confrontation or chaos, but through presence alone. As the last of the champagne flutes were cleared and the music faded into silence, she sat still for a moment longer, watching the room empty. The lights above had dimmed, but her clarity hadn't. This wasn't about victory in the traditional sense. There had been no cheers, no applause, no public declaration of justice served. But something within her had settled. Something deeper than pride. Something permanent. She left without fanfare. The limousine door opened with the same calm grace as before, and she stepped inside with no need to glance back. She didn't need to see her sister again. She didn't need to hear excuses, justifications, or apologies. There was nothing more to prove. The moment had spoken for itself, and more importantly, she had spoken to herself in silence, in presence, in the way she had refused to shrink. The car pulled away from the venue slowly, its headlights casting long shadows behind it, and for the first time in what felt like years, she breathed without weight on her chest. The city looked different through the tinted windows. Not brighter, not softer, but real. The same streets that had once felt like obstacles now felt open, stretched ahead of her with a kind of invitation. She rested her head lightly against the seat and closed her eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to take in the stillness she had earned. She had arrived in that place with a heart still bruised from years of being made to feel less than. And yet she hadn't asked for anyone's approval. She hadn't demanded attention. She had simply shown up, fully herself, and refused to be erased again. That, she realized now, was power. That was what victory looked like. Not a scene, not a takedown, but a quiet refusal to be small. The man beside her didn't speak, and she was glad for that. There was nothing left to say. Whatever had once existed between them had already served its purpose. His presence had been part of the story, but he was no longer the center of it. She was. The decision to bring him had not been about revenge or rekindling anything that had once been lost. It had been about reclaiming her story, walking into the one room where she had always been underestimated, and leaving it with her head higher than it had ever been. She didn't know what would come of their renewed connection, and for the first time she didn't need to know. She didn't need to cling to a version of the future built on someone else's idea of success. She had found her center. That was enough. In the days that followed, the phone calls trickled in. A few relatives called, not with questions but with quiet admiration. They didn't say much, just enough to let her know they had seen it. They had seen her. Some even apologized, not directly, but in the small, hesitant ways that people do when they finally realize they've been on the wrong side of silence. She accepted their words with grace, not because she needed them, but because letting go of resentment was part of the strength she now carried. There was a difference between forgiveness and forgetting. She would never forget how she had been excluded, erased, judged for not fitting into a mold built by other people's insecurities. But she no longer carried those judgments as her own. She had set them down. She had walked away from them. She returned to her apartment with the same steady rhythm that had always defined her days, but something in the air had changed. The space felt more like hers, not because it had physically shifted, but because she now occupied it fully. She moved through her routines not with a sense of obligation, but with intention. Cooking, reading, walking. Each task was a reminder that life didn't need to be loud or luxurious to be meaningful. She started sleeping more deeply, waking up with fewer worries pressing at the edge of her thoughts. She had faced the storm, and she had not only survived it, she had stood still inside it, eyes open, hands steady, heart intact. In time, the story of the wedding faded for everyone else. People moved on as they always do, chasing the next celebration, the next curated photo, the next polished performance of happiness. But she didn't need to move on. She had moved forward. She didn't replay the day in her mind with bitterness. She replayed it with clarity. She didn't crave revenge, attention, or public sympathy. What she had needed, what she had claimed, was so much more valuable than that. She had taken back her voice without shouting. She had reclaimed her space without asking. She had entered a room meant to exclude her, and made it undeniable that she belonged. Her sister didn't call. There were no follow-up texts or long-winded explanations, just silence. And for once, the silence didn't sting. It simply confirmed what she already knew, that not all relationships are meant to be repaired, and not all endings require confrontation. Sometimes the greatest closure is choosing not to chase it. She didn't need her sister's approval. She didn't need her version of success. What she had was enough. And that was more powerful than anything her sister could ever offer. Victory isn't always loud. It doesn't always arrive in applause or headlines. Sometimes it's quiet, private, and deeply personal. It looks like standing in your truth when no one expects you to. It feels like peace after years of tension. It's the kind of victory that doesn't need to be seen to be felt. The kind that doesn't fade with time because it's rooted in something unshakable. She had found that victory. Not in the limousine, not in the gasps of the crowd, not even in the look on her sister's face, but in the way she had walked through it all without losing herself. She had finally learned that power wasn't about being louder or richer or more admired. Power was about presence. And she had become a presence no one could ignore.